Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, we welcome you into us to continually make your dwelling place there in our bodies and in our hearts, in our minds and in our lives. May we look to you for the wisdom and discernment when we're deciding what to put first and what to put last. Amen. So as many of you know and remember, some may not, we are continuing with a series on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings where we look at different chapters of the book Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. It's a book about spiritual disciplines. In that book, he discusses 12 of them. And so some we are focusing on during worship, and then some we focus on in the evening for discussion. And there's overlap. You can discuss the one from worship in the evening. Also, there's no need to have read the book again to join in the discussion. Last time we had the discussion, some had, some hadn't. But Foster we're taking his book as a starting place. I'm not preaching on his book necessarily. And you're welcome to join in this discussion of spiritual disciplines if you're able. This morning, we are going to be looking at the spiritual discipline of service. As Foster categorizes things, he places service in the category of outward disciplines, which makes sense. You know, when you are serving another person, you are doing so usually outwardly. You're doing something visible. Like if I'm serving you, you can tell. It's not a secret, right? If you're serving me, I can tell. This service, of course, requires more than just the outward behaviors. It also involves things like developing an inner humility. There's a lot in service about following Jesus in eliminating hierarchies and ways that we relate to one another through power, through coercion. But it's in that category of outward disciplines, and then as all of them, it has a lot of inward work involved as well. And I think that this is a spiritual discipline that is probably more familiar to us than some of the others. I think many of us here have found ways that we are able to serve this congregation, to serve our community, to serve our neighborhoods. I think we understand in general that we're supposed to be doing that. I don't think this is anything that's going to blow your hair back that I'm talking about in terms of service. Foster makes a point to talk about how Christ calls on us to get rid of what Foster calls pecking orders. You've probably heard that term, pecking order. What is the pecking order? That is, the ones at the top peck down on the heads of the ones beneath them, and then the ones at the very bottom are just pecked, right? And so much in our life arranges itself into that sort of thing, or it's encouraged. You know, when you start a new position, there's some way to represent that pecking order, who's on top, who's on the bottom. It could be through pay, it could be through the letters after your name on your door, it could be by the name of your position, etc. And so Christ calls us to eliminate coercive authority. And Foster mentions this as part of the chapter on service, which is interesting. Service is supposed to be an interaction between equals. The one who's served is not beneath the one who serves. You aren't lesser if you're being helped. You're not greater if you're helping. This goes against some of our instincts and some of our behavior, but this is what Foster presents as the ideal of service. That is something that always occurs between equals, and if we're going to be following Jesus, we should probably just always be equals, you know, just to save all the discussion and save the worry about it, right? Now, Foster does say something that I kind of disagree with. He talks about how human nature is fundamentally hierarchical. He talks about how you can look at any sociological study of the way that human beings arrange themselves, and there's always a pecking order. There's always some kind of hierarchy that we fit into. I think that for human nature discussions, I prefer to go to anthropology compared to sociology. I think sociology describes what we do right now very well. But anthropology is where we look for what we have done across time and across culture. And if you look around the world, and if you look back in time as well as we can, you find there are innumerable ways to arrange human societies. Some are not hierarchical. There were whole empires, whole civilizations that had no apparent hierarchy. Everybody's house was the same size. There was no visible difference in wealth or burial practices. These societies lasted for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So I disagree that humans are fundamentally hierarchical, that we always find a pecking order. I think that's making an excuse for our bad behavior. Oh, it's just my nature. That's why I have to step on you, and that's why that person has to step on me. It's human nature. I don't think so. I think we're responsible for who we step on and who steps on us. And that's just a point of disagreement with Foster. If you want to discuss this, meet me on Zoom at 7 o'clock and we can talk about it. I would love to. So there's a lot to discuss in this chapter. Foster breaks down 9 forms of service that he highlights. I'm not going to go through all of them and talk about all of them. I do want to list them to give you an idea of the diversity of behaviors he talks about when he talks about service, and I'll highlight 3 of them. First is the service of hiddenness. The service of hiddenness. Part of serving is not making a big deal out of it, not wanting to be rewarded, not doing it so that we can get more respect or more status. I think we all on some level understand that, and I think we all on some level behave that way sometimes. It's nice to be acknowledged for what we do, and it can hurt to feel like we're not acknowledged for what we do. But for Foster, part of service is the service of hiddenness. He also talks about the service of small things, like incidental little life details that we think of as no big deal. But when we serve one another, even in very small details of life, a single meal, borrow a toothbrush, give somebody a ride somewhere, lend them a coat or a hat or a tool, little tiny things, that's still service. It still counts. It's still what we're supposed to be doing, even if it isn't an epic event, feeding 1,000 people, starting a nonprofit, whatever. We can serve one another in little ways. That's good to remember, because anyone can serve someone else in a little way. Foster also talks about the service of guarding other people's reputation. And in this, he talks about gossiping. He talks about a policy in churches he's served before that no one is allowed or encouraged to complain about one person in the church to another person in the church. And the encouragement is, if you're complaining to me about someone else, I respectfully say, I don't want to talk about this. Please go to that person with your concern. I'll even go with you if you're nervous. But keeping conversations one-to-one and not bringing in a third person, making a triangle, is really important. It's also really hard to avoid gossiping as humans. Like I mentioned, the anthropologists, when you look cross-culturally at what people talk about, from the tiniest hunter-gatherer band to the biggest city, something like 80% of it is gossip, just across the board. So we really struggle not to gossip about one another. But a way to serve someone is to protect their reputation, to not join in when someone is saying bad things about them when they're not there. Another way to serve is to don't tell this person something you wouldn't tell to the person you're talking about. Foster also talks about, and I'll make a lot of this in the rest of the sermon, the service of being served. Because we love to focus on serving. People who want to be part of the church will frequently come to me or come to one of the other leaders in the church and say, how can I serve? But when we ask people who needs to be served, crickets. It's amazing. Apparently everyone here has everything they have. There's nothing you need. There's no help you ever need. That's amazing. What an amazing group of people to have no needs. But we love to focus on the ways we can serve, and we avoid the ways that we need to be served, the ways we need help. It is much easier to talk about service than being served, but Foster points out that is part of service. If you have everyone who wants to serve and no one to be served, what are you going to do with yourself? Your gifts are useless in that situation. They're just surplus. He also talks about the service of common courtesy. You can see common courtesy as people enter and leave a Wawa. Have you noticed this? Entering and leaving a Wawa, you're like, oh, hello, sir, yes. You open doors for each other and make sure people walk out. And then you can see the abandonment of that spirit in the parking lot of the Wawa. As everyone drives away, cutting each other off, beeping, tailgating, weaving through one another, scurrying between cars, right? But having courtesy is a way to serve. It's a simple way to serve. We struggle with this sometimes. Struggle to pass on to our children. We have issues with that sometimes in our house about courtesy, how to be courteous. In some ways, my southern family would be appalled at our behavior. There's not nearly enough yes ma'am, no sir in our house for their liking. There's the service of hospitality, to welcome people into your home, to welcome them into your life. The service of listening, which after years and years and years of working on this and learning different ways to do it, I still have a lot to learn. I still struggle with this. But the service of listening is key. The service of bearing one another's burdens, grieving with those who grieve, mourning with those who mourn, even celebrating with those who celebrate, as we talk about in joys and concerns. And then Foster mentions the service of sharing the word of life with one another, which is interesting. Basically, nobody can hear everything God has to say to them by themselves. And so when you feel like God has done something for you or spoken to you, you share that. You don't hoard it, right? So having spoken about service and all these modes of serving, I still think we're all on the same page that we should be serving one another. But there are ways that we struggle. In fact, there are two ways that I've seen service, a willingness to serve, a spirit of service, fall apart in churches consistently, whether I've been a member or whether I've been the pastor. And I'll talk about those two ways, and I'll talk about what I think we can do about them. And this is reflected in the reading from Matthew. I invite you to reread it after the sermon, see if it illuminates anything further for you. But the first way that service falls apart is that we ask people to serve, but we're unwilling to change. And so when people come and serve, we want them to serve on our terms, to serve in the ways that we prefer, according to the habits that we have. Sometimes a ministry becomes like a territory. And we feel like this is our territory, and if you're coming into it to change it, we need to defend it. This is ours. And it's understandable if you put huge amounts of your time and life into something. But the end result of this is that welcoming people to serve becomes kind of a feeling of thanks but no thanks. Like, in effect, we're saying, we don't really need your help. We don't really need your presence, because we're not willing to be changed at all by your presence here. And you end up just feeling like unappreciated. We fail to get rid of that pecking order. We feel like, someone that we can peck upon. I'm sure that it's unconscious, but it happens. And people get pecked a couple times, and they're kind of like, all right, I'm good. I'm going to go do something else. We fail to be served, to remember that people come in to serve with us, and they have gifts too. They have things from God that we need. And so, do we approach them as ready to learn and be changed, or ready to kind of fit them into a place of what we're already doing? The second way that I see service fall short is when we serve in a way that insulates us from being served. If you're always the server and never the served, that's an imbalance in your practice of this discipline. And almost everyone I've ever met in every church is much more comfortable serving than being served. If you ask for volunteers, people line up. If you say you have extra resources to share, silence. And that's consistent across churches, across states, across personalities, politics. Sometimes the way we serve can even perpetuate the systems that make people need service. Like, you've ever thought about this? Like, why is it that the same people need the same help over and over and over and over again? Is it possibly because they need a different kind of help? But it's comfortable to be the one that serves. It's comfortable to be the one that has a lot and is able to share and to be generous. It's very uncomfortable to be the one that doesn't have enough and needs to ask. And so by refusing to be the one that doesn't have enough and needs to ask, by refusing to be served by the people we serve, we miss out on like half of the spiritual discipline that God has for us to practice. So what can we do about this? Obviously, I have some ideas. So does the author of First Peter. And I'll be focusing on that for this part of the sermon. So as we read First Peter, the first thing that is talked about is that we should discipline ourselves. Aha, perfect. We have just the book for that. We have the discussion and everything. Ready to go. Cool. Discipline ourselves. All right. Next, we are to love constantly. All right, that's difficult. Let's hear some more. First Peter, let's find out what you're talking about. To show hospitality for one another without complaining. Okay. All right, excellent. And in the culmination of this passage, the author says that we are to serve one another with all the gifts that we have been given. And again, that feels good in a way to us. But that leaves out the part where we are to be served. It helps, I think, to remember what the early church was, because this letter would have been read aloud in its entirety during a worship service to people who mostly couldn't read. And so the audience would be everybody who showed up for the ecclesia, who showed up for the gathering that day. And that group of people who showed up for the gathering that day in the early church would include the rich, the working class, beggars, slaves, women who are in authority, foreigners, orphans, adopted children, foster children. One of the big ways the early church grew was by rescuing children that were abandoned by their parents. Parents would see a child who was disabled, and they were unable to support that child, and they would leave them to die by exposure. This happened a lot in the Roman Empire. And so Christians would come and find those children and raise them. So it would have been a room full of disabled children, a room full of widows and orphans, to which Peter is saying, serve with every gift that you have. And so the beggars have a gift, and the working class people have a gift, and the orphaned children have a gift, and the widows have a gift, and the foreigners have a gift. That would have been the audience. To serve is a way, for better or for worse, to have status in a church. We show respect and honor to people who serve the most. We don't feel the same way about people who need the most help. And it's 100 times easier for us, myself included, to be the one that helps than to be the one that is helped. What it really is a selfish stance that makes us feel selfless. And that's why we get caught up in it. It's a way of being selfish, but it gives us a chance to feel selfless. Selfish in that we hold on to our gifts and our giftedness and our strengths, and we depend on all those things, and we don't open the door to our vulnerabilities and our difficulties and the things that we lack and the challenges that overwhelm us. And when we say to someone, I don't need anything, I'm fine, what we're also saying to them is, you have no place. The gifts that God has given you are useless to me. When we say that I have all that I need, we're saying to other people, you're useless. You're not here for a reason for me. And it's understandable if people take their gifts elsewhere, or feel hurt by that, or never have a chance to serve God the way they're called to serve. True service demands that we be served. Otherwise, we're telling each other and those seeking to be a part of this community, we don't need you. And people who aren't needed aren't going to stick around. So I laid out the two problems that I often see challenge us in our service, that we ask people to serve, but we're unwilling to change. And that we serve in ways that are one-sided. I serve them. I serve you. I feel good about myself. And we let it end there. We fail to be served. We refuse to be vulnerable. We refuse to make our needs known. And it is a much more difficult calling. But in order for us to truly serve, we must be willing to be served. Amen.